Before we step inside the mind of one of Resident Evil's most haunted survivors, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the Deep Dive series. This is the tragic life of Jill Valentine, not just the battles she survived, but the trauma, manipulation, and years of silent damage that reshaped her long after the monsters were gone. Part 1, Jill, before Raccoon City. To understand the ghost that Jill Valentine became, we must first examine the woman she was before the world dissolved into biological rot. Born to a French father and a Japanese mother, Jill grew up between two worlds, never fully belonging to either, which fostered a sense of observational detachment and self-reliance from a young age. Her father was a man of complex morals and a legendary skill set in the art of entry and infiltration. Under his tutelage, Jill became a master of unlocking, not just of physical doors, but of the systems that define the modern world. She was a skilled thief, a professional who operated in the shadows of society, using her pragmatic and utilitarian view of the law to navigate the grey areas between right and wrong. This pre-police life was defined by a quiet confidence and a belief that any barrier could be bypassed if one was clever enough and patient enough. The iron reality of Jill's early life was her flexibility. Unlike her peers in the Raccoon City Police Department, who viewed the law as a rigid and unbreaking line, Jill understood that the world was composed of locks and keys. She did not operate out of a desire for chaos, but out of a professional appreciation for the hidden path. This background gave her a unique psychological advantage. She was comfortable in the dark, and she did not fear the unknown. However, it also meant that she was accustomed to operating alone. She did not seek the validation of a badge or the camaraderie of a unit until much later in her life. This early independence was her greatest strength, but it also meant that she had no foundation of social support when the trauma of the 1990s finally arrived. She was a woman built for the shadow world, and when the shadow world eventually turned into a nightmare of meat and virus, she was the only one who truly knew how to pick the lock of survival. The sorrow of this early period was the slow erosion of her father's influence, as she sought to turn her skills toward a more legitimate purpose. Jill's decision to leave the life of a thief and join the police force was a pursuit of redemption, an attempt to use her master of unlocking abilities for the greater good. She wanted to prove that she was more than just the daughter of a criminal. She carried an internal pressure to be perfect, to be beyond reproach, and to be the most efficient officer in the department. This drive for perfection would later become her psychological armor. But in the pre-Raccoon City era, it was simply a sign of a woman who was trying to outrun her own history. She was idealistic in a quiet and disciplined way, believing that the truth was something that could be uncovered through hard work and tactical precision. She did not yet know that there are some truths so horrific that no amount of skill can make them bearable. Ultimately, the Jill Valentine of the early 1990s was a woman of potential and pragmatic grace. She was a master of her craft and a rising star in the tactical world, but her soul was still untouched by the visceral horror of the Arklay Mountains. She viewed her infiltration skills as a game of chess against the architecture of the world, unaware that the architecture was being redesigned by a corporate god who intended to use her as a laboratory subject. Her transition from the shadows of the thief to the light of the police officer was her first major life shift, a search for identity that would soon be shattered by the arrival of the STARS program. She was the master of unlocking, but she was about to find herself trapped in a room where there was no key and no exit. Part 2. Military Training and Isolation. Before Jill Valentine joined the elite STARS unit, she was forged in the fires of the United States Army Delta Force training program. She was the only woman to participate in the program at that time, a distinction that brought with it an intense and crushing level of scrutiny and isolation. To survive in an all-male environment defined by hyper-aggression and peak physical performance, Jill was forced to adopt an emotions-off mindset. She learned that any display of vulnerability was not just a personal weakness, but a liability to the entire unit. The iron discipline of Delta Force required her to build a massive psychological wall between her internal self and her external performance. She became a tactical machine capable of suppressing fear, pain, and empathy to achieve the mission objective. This conditioning was the foundation of her hypercompetence, but it also created a permanent emotional scar that would make her later PTSD almost impossible to treat. The training in the Delta Force program was designed to break the individual and rebuild them as a weapon. For Jill, this process was doubly intense because she had to prove her worth every single day to men who did not want her there. She learned to speak the language of lead and steel, and she mastered the art of high-pressure infiltration. However, the cost was a total withdrawal from her own emotional life. She viewed her feelings as biological noise that needed to be filtered out to maintain tactical focus. The sorrow of this isolation was that Jill lost the ability to connect with others on a human level during her most formative years. She became a ghost in the barracks, a woman who could outshoot and outclimb her peers, but who could not share a meal or a conversation without maintaining a professional distance. This self-imposed isolation was a survival mechanism that would eventually trap her in a cycle of loneliness and hypervigilance. By the time Jill emerged from her military service, she was a woman who was perfectly functional but emotionally stunted. She had been trained to view the world through a tactical lens, where every person was a target or an asset, and every environment was a series of cover points and exit routes. This military isolation made her the perfect candidate for the STARS Alpha team, but it also ensured that she would never be able to return to a normal civilian life. She had been deconstructed by the state and rebuilt as a tool for high-intensity conflict. The iron will she developed was unbreakable, but it was also rigid, making her brittle when faced with the chaotic and illogical horror of the biological outbreaks. She did not know how to process a situation that could not be solved with a rifle or a tactical maneuver. The legacy of her military training was a life defined by a cold and sharp efficiency. She was the best at what she did, but she was also the most alone. When she eventually arrived in Raccoon City, she was already carrying the weight of a decade of suppressed trauma and isolated struggle. The Delta Force program had given her the skills to survive the mansion and the nemesis, but it had also robbed her of the emotional tools required to heal once the fighting was over. She was a soldier who had forgotten how to be a person, and that void in her psyche would eventually be filled by the very viruses she was sent to destroy. Jill Valentine was the ultimate weapon, but the man who held the handle was an elite military structure that had no interest in her soul. Part 3. Joining STARS. Joining the Raccoon City. STARS. Alpha Team was Jill's attempt to find a home for her specialized skills and her lingering sense of idealism. She believed that by joining this elite unit, she could finally use her Master of Unlocking abilities and her Delta Force training for a cause that was unequivocally good. The STARS program represented the pinnacle of law enforcement, and Jill viewed her teammates, Chris Redfield, Barry Burton, and even Albert Wesker, as the brothers and mentors she had never had. She allowed herself to hope that she had finally found a place where she belonged, The iron logic of the STARS mission was to provide a surgical response to the growing crime and instability in the Raccoon City area, and Jill threw herself into the work with a fanatical devotion. She wanted to be the perfect officer in the perfect unit. The early days of STARS were the last moments of peace in Jill's life. She formed a deep and lasting bond with Chris Redfield, based on mutual respect and shared experience, while Barry Burton became a paternal figure who offered her a glimpse of the family life she had missed. For a brief window, Jill began to lower her psychological walls, believing that she was safe among her peers. The sorrow of this period was the fragility of her hope. She did not realize that the entire STARS unit had been engineered by Umbrella to serve as a high-level experiment in combat data. Her idealism was being nurtured by the very man who was preparing to lead her into a slaughterhouse. Jill's belief that she was protecting the city was a lie that had been carefully constructed to ensure her participation in the upcoming nightmare. The transition from the urban patrolling of Raccoon City to the investigation of the Arklay Mountains was the moment Jill's reality began to crack. As reports of cannibalistic murders and strange sightings in the forest increased, the STARS teams were deployed into an environment that was beyond their training. Jill's initial reaction was one of professional curiosity and tactical readiness, but as the mission progressed, the idealism she had cultivated began to dissolve into a cold and paralyzing dread. The moment the Alpha Team's helicopter landed in the dark woods, Jill's world was reset. She was no longer an officer of the law. She was a survivor in a world that had abandoned all laws of biology and physics. The unit she had joined to protect the world was about to be dismantled, and she would be forced to watch her friends die in a series of horrific and inexplicable ways. Joining STARS was the final step in Jill's journey toward the abyss. It gave her the comrades she would eventually lose, and the purpose that would eventually consume her. She entered the Arklay forest as a woman who believed in the power of the badge and the strength of the team, but she would emerge as something else entirely. The idealistic officer died in the shadows of the Spencer mansion, and the Jill Valentine who remained was a woman who had seen the face of the future and found it was a rotting mask. This was the first true destruction of her sense of self, a psychological break that would be the foundation for all the tragedy that followed. She had joined the elite to save the world, but she would soon realize that the elite were the ones who were burning it down. Part 4. The Spencer Mansion Incident. The July 1998 incident at the Spencer Mansion was the point of no return for Jill Valentine's psychological health. This was not just a difficult mission. It was a total and violent restructuring of her reality. The transition from a standard tactical investigation to a biological horror show was too rapid for the human mind to process. Within the first hour, Jill witnessed the horrific death of Joseph Frost, who was torn apart by infected hounds, and she was forced to flee into a mansion that was itself a labyrinthine trap designed to harvest her fear. The iron reality of the mansion was its absolute hostility to human life. Every room contained a new and grotesque violation of nature, from the moaning corpses of former researchers to the massive mutated spiders and sharks that roamed the halls. Jill's sense of physical safety, which had been reinforced by years of elite training, was destroyed in a matter of seconds. The trauma of the mansion was visceral and sensory. Jill was forced to navigate through narrow corridors, filled with the smell of rotting meat and the sound of scratching claws. She found the mutilated bodies of her teammates, men like Forrest Speyer, who had been turned into a mindless shell of his former self. This was the first time Jill encountered the concept of the biological violation. The idea that a person could be stripped of their humanity and turned into a weapon against their own friends. The sorrow of the Spencer mansion was the realization that the environment she was in was designed by a human mind to be a graveyard. The puzzles she solved and the doors she unlocked were not challenges to her skill, but parts of a sick game of survival data. She was no longer a master of unlocking. She was a rat in a maze being monitored by a cold and invisible observer. The psychological break Jill experienced in the mansion was characterized by a loss of trust in the physical world. If a floor could become a trap and a dead body could become a predator, then nothing was safe. She began to experience the first symptoms of what would become a lifelong struggle with hypervigilance. Her ears were constantly strained for the sound of a closing door or a shuffling footstep, and her heart was in a state of permanent, high-intensity stress. This was the moment Jill's emotions off switch failed her. The horror was too great to be suppressed, and she was forced to feel the raw terror of her own mortality. By the time she reached the lower levels of the lab and discovered the truth about the T virus, her mind was already fractured. She was fighting for her life, but she was also losing her grip on the version of herself that existed before the mission. The Spencer mansion was the forge where the modern Jill Valentine was made, but the forge was fueled by the bodies of her friends. She escaped the facility before it exploded, but she carried the mansion with her in her mind. The silence of the forest, the ticking of a clock, and the smell of a laboratory would forever trigger the memories of the nightmare. She had survived the physical ordeal, but her sense of the world as a place of order and justice was gone. She was a survivor, but she was also a victim of a psychological assault that would never truly end. The mansion was not just a place. It was the first chapter of her true tragedy, the beginning of a life lived in the shadow of the Umbrella Corporation. Part 5. Betrayal by Wesker. Of all the horrors Jill Valentine encountered in the Spencer mansion, none was as devastating as the revelation that her captain and mentor, Albert Wesker, was the architect of the nightmare. This was the moment of total trust collapse, a fundamental shift in Jill's psyche that would leave her with a permanent state of paranoia. Wesker was the man who had recruited her into STARS, the man who had led the Alpha team with a cold and reassuring efficiency, and the man Jill had looked up to as the pinnacle of tactical leadership. Finding him in the underground lab, standing over the tyrant and revealing his allegiance to Umbrella, was a psychological blow that hit harder than any physical wound. The iron will of Jill Valentine was broken by the realization that her hero was a monster who had lured his own team to their deaths for the sake of biological research. The betrayal by Wesker was not just a professional disappointment. It was a personal violation of the highest order. Wesker had used Jill's loyalty, her skills, and her trust against her. He had watched from the shadows as she struggled to survive the traps and the creatures he had helped create. The sorrow of this betrayal was the absolute erasure of Jill's moral compass. If the man at the top of the chain of command was evil, then the entire structure of the world was compromised. She began to view every authority figure, every government agency, and every corporate entity as a potential Wesker, a smiling mask hiding a predatory intent. This was the birth of her lifelong paranoia, a state of mind where she could never truly believe in the goodness of others, because she had seen how easily it could be faked by a sociopath. The confrontation with Wesker in the laboratory also introduced Jill to the concept of the God complex that would haunt her for decades. She saw in Wesker the ultimate expression of human arrogance, a man who believed he was above the laws of nature and morality. This solidified her obsession with taking down Umbrella and anyone who shared Wesker's vision. Her grief and her shock were immediately converted into a cold and burning hatred. She no longer fought for the law, she fought for vengeance. This shift in motivation was a coping mechanism, a way to distract herself from the agonizing pain of the betrayal. If she could focus on the mission of stopping Wesker, she wouldn't have to face the fact that she had been betrayed by the one person who was supposed to protect her. The betrayal by Wesker left a scar on Jill's soul that would never heal. Even after his apparent death in the mansion explosion, she lived in fear of his return, a fear that would eventually be proven right. She had learned the hardest lesson of the Arklay incident, that the real monsters are not the ones with the claws and the teeth, but the ones who wear the sunglasses and the captain's bars. This trust collapse would define her relationship with every partner she ever had, including Chris Redfield. She would always be waiting for the next betrayal, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jill Valentine had survived the mansion, but she had lost the ability to trust the world, and without trust, she was a ghost, wandering through a landscape of potential enemies. Part 6. Survivors' guilt sets in the immediate wake of the Spencer Mansion explosion. As the morning sun rose over the Arklay Mountains, Jill Valentine found herself in a state of profound psychological dissonance. While the physical battle had ended, the internal war of the survivor was only just beginning. As one of only 5 Alpha Team members to make it out of the woods alive, Jill began to grapple with the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. This was not a simple feeling of sadness, but a complex and corrosive mental state, where she began to ask why she had been spared while her peers were slaughtered. She internalized the deaths of Joseph Frost Forrest Speyer and the countless other STARS members who had been turned into biological waste. The iron reality of her survival was that it felt unearned, and this feeling began to erode her sense of worth from the inside out. Instead of processing the trauma through traditional mourning, Jill converted her grief into a cold and obsessive drive to dismantle the Umbrella Corporation. The clinical expression of Jill's guilt was a total rejection of the concept of peace. She could not allow herself to rest, because to rest was to acknowledge the silence of those who had fallen. She spent her nights in Raccoon City, obsessively reviewing the data she had gathered, and her days stalking the shadows of the corporate offices. The sorrow of this period was her inability to reconnect with the civilian world. She walked the streets of the city, seeing potential infections in every cough and potential traps in every alleyway. Her apartment became a fortress of files and firearms, a physical manifestation of her inability to move past the Arklay incident. She used the mission as a distraction from the pain of her loss, but the distraction was itself a form of trauma. By refusing to face her grief, she ensured that it would remain a permanent and festering part of her psyche. Furthermore, Jill's survivor's guilt manifested as a form of hyper-responsibility. She felt that because she had survived, she was now solely responsible for the safety of the entire city. This was a burden that no human mind could carry, and it led to a state of chronic exhaustion and irritability. She pushed away anyone who tried to help her, including Barry Burton, because their presence reminded her of what they had lost. She viewed her own life as a debt that had to be paid through the destruction of Umbrella. This moral accounting meant that every day she was not fighting. The corporation was a day she was failing her dead teammates. This was the point where Jill stopped being an officer of the law and started being a ghost of the mansion, a woman who lived for a war that the rest of the world did not yet know was happening. The long-term effect of this guilt was the creation of a purpose-driven identity that left no room for the actual Jill Valentine. She became the mission. Every action she took was filtered through the lens of her anti-umbrella obsession. While this made her a formidable opponent for the corporation, it also meant that she was hollowed out as an individual. She had no hobbies, no dreams, and no future beyond the next laboratory raid. She was a woman waiting for the next disaster to justify her survival. This psychological entrapment was the true legacy of the Arklay Mountains, proving that the T-virus did not need to infect a body to destroy a life. Jill was a survivor, in name only. In reality, she was still trapped in the mansion, wandering the halls of her own memory and looking for the teammates she could never bring back. Part 7. Being Hunted by Nemesis. The September 1998 outbreak in Raccoon City was a different experience for Jill Valentine than it was for any other survivor. While Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield were navigating the chaos of a city in collapse, Jill was being systematically and relentlessly targeted by an apex biological predator known as the Nemesis T-type. This was not a random encounter with a zombie. This was a personalized trauma delivery system designed by Umbrella to eliminate the remaining STARS witnesses. The arrival of the Nemesis introduced a new level of psychological terror into Jill's life because it stripped away the concept of a safe zone. The creature could track her through walls, jump across buildings, and follow her across the entire metropolitan area. This created a state of permanent hypervigilance where even the briefest moment of silence felt like a precursor to a violent assault. The iron logic of the Nemesis was its singleness of purpose. Every time it roared the word STARS, it was a psychological weapon intended to remind Jill that her past was literally coming to kill her. The sorrow of being hunted was the total erasure of Jill's mental sanctuary. In previous missions, she could find a room and lock the door to gather her thoughts. But with the Nemesis, doors were merely suggestions. This relentless pursuit caused Jill's brain to remain in a state of high-intensity fight or flight for days on end. The constant surge of adrenaline and cortisol began to damage her cognitive functions, leading to a blurring of the line between reality and nightmare. She was no longer just a woman trying to escape a city. She was a prey animal being toyed with by a god of rot. This experience solidified her belief that she was marked for death, and that there was no corner of the world where she could truly hide. The Nemesis also represented the industrialization of the trauma Jill had experienced in the mansion. The creature was a refined version of the Tyrant, a symbol of Umbrella's ability to perfect their nightmares. Seeing the Nemesis execute Brad Vickers in front of her was a psychological blow that hit her at her core. It was a reminder that her unit was being systematically erased and that she was the final piece on the board. The hypervigilance born from this hunt would stay with her for decades. In the year 2026, she still finds herself checking the corners of every room and listening for the heavy footfalls of a giant. The Nemesis did more than just hunt her body. It hunted her sense of agency and her belief in her own skill. No matter how many locks she picked or how many traps she set, the Nemesis simply walked through them, proving that her master of unlocking identity was meaningless in the face of raw biological power. The legacy of the Nemesis hunt was the realization that the world had become a predatory landscape. Jill could no longer trust the architecture of a city to provide protection. This led to a permanent shift in her tactical philosophy, where she began to view every environment as a combat zone and every person as a potential victim of the next pursuit. The trauma of being targeted by a thinking weapon was a unique violation that separated her from other survivors. While others faced a disaster, Jill faced an executioner. This distinction made her colder and more detached, as she realized that she was not just fighting for survival, but for the right to exist in a world that wanted her dead. The nemesis was the shadow of her past made flesh, and its presence ensured that she would never again feel the comfort of safety. Part 8. Loss of control and constant fear. The primary psychological casualty of the Raccoon City incident for Jill Valentine was her sense of control. As a master of unlocking and a Delta Force graduate, Jill had spent her entire life mastering the art of agency, the belief that she could manipulate her environment to ensure her safety. The nemesis and the total collapse of the city dismantled this belief entirely. She found herself in a situation where her skills were irrelevant against a force that did not follow the rules of human conflict. This loss of control led to a state of constant fear that was not a sharp scream, but a low and humming vibration in her bones. She began to realize that no matter how perfectly she executed a plan, the world could simply break the floor beneath her feet. This was the ultimate nightmare for someone who valued autonomy above all else. The iron reality of this fear was its paralyzing effect on her long-term mental health. Jill began to second-guess her every move, wondering if her next choice would lead to another teammate's death or her own capture. The sorrow of this period was the erosion of her self-confidence. She began to see herself not as a hero, but as a lucky casualty, a person who was only alive because the monsters had not yet decided to kill her. This feeling of powerlessness was reinforced every time the nemesis destroyed a building she was hiding in, or every time she witnessed the military's failed attempts to contain the outbreak. The city she had sworn to protect was being nuked by the government she had served, and she was powerless to stop the missile. This was a total failure of the systems she believed in, leaving her in a psychological vacuum where fear was the only constant. Furthermore, the constant fear led to a state of emotional exhaustion that Jill would never truly recover from. Her mind was so occupied with the logistics of survival that she had no space left for empathy or connection. When she met Carlos Oliveira, she treated him more as a tactical asset than a human being, reflecting her military isolation. She was terrified of becoming attached to anyone because she knew that in a world without control, everyone was disposable. This loss of control was also a biological one, as she watched the city's population transform into mindless predators. She realized that the very cells of her body were vulnerable to the viral whim of Umbrella. This created a profound sense of body dysmorphia and existential dread that would later be exacerbated by her own infection. The legacy of this loss of control was a woman who was obsessed with perfection in her later years. Because she had felt so powerless in Raccoon City, she sought to become a person who was never caught off guard again. She trained until her hands bled and studied every viral strain until she knew them by heart. But this quest for control was a hollow one, because she knew deep down that it was an illusion. The fear she felt in 1998 remained a permanent resident in her mind, a reminder that at any moment the world could return to the chaos of the city. Jill Valentine became a master of combat to hide the fact that she was still a terrified girl in a burning city looking for a door that she couldn't unlock. Part 9. Infection and Near Death. The moment the nemesis infected Jill Valentine with the T-virus was the moment she stopped seeing herself as a human being. This was the ultimate biological violation, a physical intrusion that turned her own DNA into a weapon against her. As the virus began to take hold of her system, Jill experienced a rapid decline into a state of delirium and near death. This was not just a medical crisis, it was a psychological erasure. She was forced to confront the reality that she was becoming the very thing she had spent months fighting. The iron logic of the virus was its cold and indifferent consumption of her identity. She could feel her thoughts slipping away, replaced by the primal urges of the infected. The sorrow of this infection was her total reliance on Carlos Oliveira to find the vaccine a vulnerability that she found deeply humiliating and terrifying. The experience of near death changed Jill's relationship with her own body forever. Even after the vaccine was administered and she was physically cured, she knew that her biological makeup had been permanently altered. She was no longer pure in her own eyes. She was a hybrid, a survivor, with viral residues in her blood. This led to a profound sense of isolation from the rest of the human race. She felt like a biological anomaly, an outsider who could never truly return to a normal life. This stain on her psyche contributed to her emotional withdrawal from others, as she feared that she was a ticking time bomb or a carrier of the very plague she loathed. The infection was the moment she realized that the war against Umbrella was not just happening in the labs, but inside her own veins. Furthermore, the infection provided a glimpse into the godhood that Wesker and Spencer sought. During her fever dreams, Jill experienced a sense of the viral power, the raw evolutionary force that Umbrella was trying to harness. This made her hatred for the corporation even more personal, because she understood the visceral horror of the gift they were trying to give the world. She had seen the abyss from the inside, and it had left her with a permanent state of existential dread. By the time she was rescued from the city before the nuclear strike, she was a different person. She had been killed by the virus and reborn as a survivor, but the version of Jill that emerged was colder, sharper, and more detached from her own humanity. The legacy of the infection was a lifelong struggle with medical trauma. Every blood test, every needle, and every clinical smell would forever trigger the memory of the nemesis's tentacle and the burning sensation of the virus. She became a woman who was intensely guarded about her physical health, yet also reckless with her own life, believing that she was already on borrowed time. The infection was the final proof that nowhere was safe, not even her own skin. Jill Valentine had survived the T-virus, but she would spend the rest of her life feeling like she was an intruder in a world of normal people. She was a ghost of the infection, a living relic of a biological war that had left its mark on her soul and her DNA. Part 10, PTSD, after Raccoon City. The year 1998 ended with the nuclear destruction of Raccoon City. But for Jill Valentine, the explosion was only the beginning of a lifelong struggle with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The 2026 records confirm that Jill suffered from severe nightmares, emotional numbing, and a state of permanent hypervigilance. She was unable to maintain a normal social or professional life because the world around her had become a minefield of triggers. Every loud noise sounded like the roar of the nemesis. Every flickering light reminded her of the burning streets of the city. She had entered a state of survival mode that was no longer necessary for her physical safety, but was biologically hardwired into her brain. The iron reality of her PTSD was that her mind was still in Raccoon City, even as her body moved through the rest of the world. The clinical analysis of Jill's PTSD revealed a total collapse of her ability to feel joy or relaxation. She suffered from emotional numbing, a psychological defense mechanism that prevented her from feeling the pain of her trauma, but also prevented her from feeling anything else. She became a tactical machine in her civilian life, unable to have a conversation that wasn't about the threat of Umbrella or the next biological outbreak. The sorrow of this period was her isolation from the other survivors. While Chris Redfield focused on building the BSAA, Jill retreated into her own mind, finding comfort only in the mission. She was terrified of the silence of her own apartment, because in the silence she could hear the screams of those who were left behind in the blast zone. This was a life lived in the shadow of a mushroom cloud, a state of existence where the war was never over. Jill's hypervigilance also manifested as a pathological need for readiness. She slept with a weapon under her pillow and memorized the floor plans of every building she entered. She was unable to trust any environment that she had not personally vetted for safety. This was not a choice. It was a biological imperative. Her brain was constantly searching for threats, because it had learned that threats were always present and always lethal. This chronic stress began to take a toll on her physical health, leading to insomnia and a weakened immune system. She was a woman who was physically safe, but her mind was still being hunted by the ghosts of the STARS unit. The PTSD was the ultimate victory for Umbrella, proving that they could destroy a person without ever killing them. The legacy of this post-Raccoon City trauma was the creation of the ghost Jill, who would eventually sacrifice herself in the fight against Wesker. She felt that her life was already over, and that she was simply waiting for the final mission to justify her survival. She did not seek treatment because she did not believe she could be healed. To Jill, the trauma was not a disease. It was the truth. She viewed the rest of the world as being in a state of delusion, and she was the only one who saw the world for the predatory place it really was. This isolation was the final wall that she could not pick the lock of. Jill Valentine had survived the fire, but she was still burning inside, a victim of a psychological damage that no amount of time or therapy could ever fully erase. Part 11, Anti-Umbrella, Obsession. By the early 2000s, the woman known as Jill Valentine had ceased to exist in any traditional sense of the word. She had been entirely replaced by a singular and cold objective, which was the total eradication of the Umbrella Corporation from the face of the earth. This was not a healthy professional goal, but a pathological and all-consuming obsession that served as her only defense against the crushing weight of her own memory. Following the nuclear sanitization of Raccoon City, Jill did not seek the solace of a quiet life or the support of a therapist. Instead, she turned her apartment into a tactical command center and her mind into a repository for corporate conspiracies and viral data. The iron logic of her obsession was that as long as Umbrella existed, her trauma had a tangible target. If she could destroy the company, she believed she could somehow retroactively save the people she had lost in the Arklay Mountains. The clinical reality of this obsession was that it acted as a psychological bypass for her healing process. Whenever the silence of the night threatened to bring back the screams of the dying, or the heavy footsteps of the nemesis, Jill would dive deeper into a new set of stolen files or a surveillance mission. She used the adrenaline of the hunt to mask the vacuum of her soul. The sorrow of this period was the total loss of her civilian identity. She did not have a home, she had a safe house. She did not have friends, she had tactical assets. Her life was defined by a state of constant motion, moving from the streets of Europe to the hidden labs of Russia, always searching for the head of the serpent. This obsession was the only thing that kept her from the total psychological collapse that usually follows a trauma of her magnitude. She had found a way to weaponize her PTSD, turning her hypervigilance into a tool for global espionage. Furthermore, this anti-umbrella mission allowed Jill to avoid the terrifying prospect of a future. To Jill, a future was an abstract concept that belonged to people who had not seen their city burn. By dedicating every waking second to the destruction of her enemy, she ensured that she never had to ask what she would do if the war actually ended. She was terrified of peace, because in peace she was just a woman with a broken mind and a scarred body. In the war, she was the legendary Jill Valentine, the master of unlocking and the survivor of the mansion. This psychological attachment to the conflict meant that she was subconsciously incentivized to keep the war going. She was not just hunting Umbrella, she was using Umbrella to hide from herself. This cycle of obsession ensured that by the time the corporation finally collapsed in 2003, Jill was already too far gone to return to a normal existence. The legacy of this obsession was a woman who was perfectly optimized for combat, but entirely unfit for humanity. She had spent years conditioning herself to see the world as a series of targets and threats, which left her unable to experience the simple joys of connection or relaxation. Even as she joined the newly formed BSAA, she did so not out of a sense of civic duty, but because it provided the resources she needed to continue her hunt. She was a ghost in the machine of international security, a woman who was valued for her lethality, but ignored for her suffering. Jill Valentine had become the ultimate anti-umbrella weapon, but in the process, she had sacrificed the very soul she was trying to protect. She was a master of unlocking who had locked her own heart in a vault and thrown away the key. Part 12. Emotional withdrawal from others. As Jill Valentine moved further into her career as a founding member of the BSAA, she began a process of systematic emotional withdrawal that would define her relationships for the next 2 decades. Despite the deep bonds she had formed during the Raccoon City era, Jill began to view any form of emotional intimacy as a tactical liability. She had seen too many people die and too many friends turn into monsters to believe that any connection was permanent. The iron reality of her withdrawal was a self-imposed isolation designed to protect herself from the agony of future loss. She maintained a sharp professional distance from her peers and even her closest partners, like Chris Redfield and Barry Burton. While she would die for them on the battlefield, she refused to live for them in the quiet moments of peace. She had built a psychological wall that was thicker than any laboratory bulkhead. The clinical expression of this withdrawal was a state of emotional numbing, where Jill appeared calm and focused even in the face of absolute horror. To the outside observer, she was the pinnacle of military discipline, but to those who knew her, it was clear that she was no longer fully present. She spoke in short, tactical sentences and avoided any conversation that touched on her internal state. The sorrow of this isolation was the impact it had on Chris Redfield, who remained the only person who truly understood the depth of her trauma. Jill used their partnership as a shield against true intimacy. By keeping their relationship strictly focused on the mission, she could avoid the terrifying vulnerability of admitting how much she needed him. She convinced herself that by staying alone, she was keeping Chris safe, as if her own trauma was a contagious virus that would eventually consume anyone who got too close. Furthermore, Jill's withdrawal was driven by a profound sense of body dysmorphia and existential guilt. Following her infection in 1998, she felt that she was biologically tainted, a hybrid creature that no longer belonged to the world of normal humans. This feeling of being an outsider made her feel like a fraud when she engaged in social interactions. She felt that if people truly knew what was in her blood and in her mind, they would recoil in horror. This led to a state of hypervigilance where she constantly monitored her own behavior to ensure she was projecting the correct image of a hero. The energy required to maintain this mask left her exhausted and resentful, further driving her desire to be alone. She was a woman who was surviving in a crowd, but she was actually wandering in a desert of her own making. The legacy of this emotional withdrawal was the creation of the Ice Queen persona that many younger BSAA members admired and feared. They saw her coldness as a sign of strength, not realizing it was a symptom of a deep and unhealed wound. Jill had become so efficient at hiding her feelings that she had eventually lost the ability to feel them at all. This made her the perfect soldier for the bio-warfare era, but a tragic figure in the history of human connection. When she looked in the mirror, she did not see a friend, a daughter, or a partner. She saw a tactical asset with a limited shelf life. Jill Valentine had successfully unlocked every door in the world except for the one that led back to her own humanity, and she was increasingly content to let that door remain rusted shut. Part 13. Wesker's Return. The year 2006 marked the moment when the fragile house of cards that was Jill Valentine's life finally collapsed. During a mission to the Spencer estate in Europe, Jill and Chris Redfield discovered that their greatest nightmare, Albert Wesker, was not only alive, but was more powerful than ever. The sudden return of Wesker was a psychological cataclysm for Jill, because it proved that her years of obsession and sacrifice had been built on a lie. The man who had betrayed her in the mansion, the man she had spent nearly a decade hunting, was standing before her as a god. This revelation reopened every psychological wound from 1998, with a violent force that shattered her remaining sense of control. The iron reality of that encounter was the realization that Wesker was an inevitable force that could not be outrun or outshot. The moment of Wesker's return triggered a total collapse of Jill's tactical confidence. She saw Chris being slowly crushed by Wesker's supernatural strength, and in that second, she realized that the mission had failed and her partner was going to die. The sorrow of the Spencer estate was the choice Jill made in that instant. In an act of suicidal heroism, Jill tackled Wesker through a window and over a cliff into the crashing waves of the ocean below. While this was framed as a heroic sacrifice for the sake of her partner, the clinical reality was more complex. Jill had already lost her will to live in a world where Wesker was alive. By throwing herself off the cliff, she was choosing a definitive end to the nightmare, rather than facing another decade of being hunted. She was not just trying to save Chris, she was trying to save herself from the agony of being a survivor one last time. Furthermore, the act of tackling Wesker was the final expression of Jill's emotions-off conditioning. In that moment, she bypassed all logic and self-preservation to achieve the only objective that mattered. It was the ultimate master of unlocking move, picking the lock of a stalemate by sacrificing the key. But the tragedy was that she did not die. She survived the fall, only to be captured by the very man she had tried to kill. This was the ultimate cosmic cruelty. Jill had finally allowed herself to seek the peace of death, only to wake up in a laboratory being poked and prodded by the ghost of her past. Her sacrifice had achieved nothing but her own capture, and the subsequent trauma of being a prisoner in her own body. This was the point where Jill's story moved from a tragedy of trauma to a tragedy of absolute violation. The legacy of Wesker's return was the final destruction of Jill's agency. She had tried to end the war on her own terms, and she had failed. This failure left her with a deep sense of shame and worthlessness, that would haunt her during her years of captivity. She believed she had failed Chris. She had failed the stars, and she had failed herself. She was now in the hands of the one person who knew exactly how to break her. The return of Wesker was not just a plot twist in a biological war. It was the final judgment on Jill's attempt to heal through obsession. She had stared into the abyss for too long, and now the abyss was taking her home. Jill Valentine was no longer a soldier or a survivor. She was a subject, and her true nightmare was only just beginning. Part 14. Loss of Agency. From the year 2006 until 2009, Jill Valentine existed in a state of absolute psychological and physical violation. Following her capture at the Spencer estate, she was used as a laboratory specimen for Wesker's Ouroboros research. To ensure her compliance and to enhance her physical capabilities, Wesker utilized a chemical compound known as P30. This was not a simple drug, but a high-potency neural inhibitor that placed Jill in a state of conscious enslavement. The iron horror of this period was that Jill remained fully aware of her surroundings and her actions, but was biologically incapable of resisting the commands of her captors. This was the total erosion of her identity, the ultimate nightmare for a woman who had spent her entire life mastering the art of self-reliance and autonomy. The clinical experience of being under the influence of P30 was described by Jill as being a passenger in her own body. She watched through her own eyes as her hands performed tasks she loathed, and her voice spoke words that were not her own. She was forced into a state of cryogenic stasis and then revived to serve as a high-level enforcer for Wesker and the Tricell Corporation. The sorrow of this loss of agency was the constant internal scream that no one could hear. Every time she was forced to participate in a biological experiment or a tactical strike, she was experiencing a new layer of moral injury. Her elite training, her Delta Force skills, and her master of unlocking precision were all being used to facilitate the very extinction event she had dedicated her life to preventing. This was a psychological violation that surpassed the horror of the mansion or the city. Furthermore, the loss of agency was exacerbated by the physical changes Wesker forced upon her. The high doses of P30 and the viral experimentation turned her hair white and her skin pale, a permanent physical reminder of her time as a puppet. She felt like she was being slowly erased and replaced by a cold and efficient machine. This was the ghost Jill in its most literal form, a shell of a human being inhabited by a chemical command. The psychological impact of being a spectator to her own crimes was so profound that it led to a fragmentation of her personality. To survive the internal agony, Jill had to retreat into the deepest corners of her mind, creating a mental barrier between herself and the actions of the Bird Lady Enforcer. This was a survival mechanism that would leave her with severe agency anxiety for the rest of her life, never truly trusting that her movements were her own. The legacy of this 3-year enslavement was a woman who was fundamentally broken at the level of the will. When Chris Redfield finally found her in Kajuju, she was not a damsel in distress waiting to be saved. She was a weapon aimed at his heart. The violation of her agency was so complete that she was willing to kill the only person she loved because a chemical told her to do so. This was the ultimate victory for Wesker, proving that he could turn the greatest hero of the STARS unit into his most loyal servant. Even after the device was removed and the chemical was purged, the memory of that powerlessness remained. Jill Valentine would spend the rest of her life wondering if she was truly in control, or if she was just waiting for the next master to pull the strings. Her agency was a stolen thing, and the thief was a man she could never truly escape. Part 15. Being used as a weapon. The deepest and most agonizing violation Jill Valentine ever experienced was the period during the Kijuju incident, where she was forced to fight Chris Redfield. This was not just a physical confrontation, but a total subversion of her soul. Wesker took great pleasure in using Jill's elite military training and her intimate knowledge of Chris's tactical habits against him. She was forced to utilize the very skills they had honed together in the STARS unit to attempt to end his life. This moral injury was a psychological wound that no vaccine or rescue could ever heal. To be used as a weapon against the one person who represented the last shred of her humanity was a betrayal of everything Jill believed in. The iron logic of the Kijuju battle was its cruelty designed specifically to break the spirit of both Jill and Chris simultaneously. The clinical reality of the fight was a showcase of Jill's hypercompetence. Under the influence of P30, her speed and precision were enhanced to superhuman levels, making her a terrifying opponent. But inside the mask, Jill was experiencing a total psychological collapse. She was witnessing herself attempting to kill her partner, and she could do nothing to stop her hands from moving. The sorrow of this violation was the look in Chris's eyes as he realized who was behind the mask. He was not just fighting a monster, he was fighting the woman he had spent 3 years mourning. This mutual trauma was exactly what Wesker intended. He wanted to prove that even the strongest human bond was nothing more than biological data that could be rewritten and weaponized. Jill was not just a pawn in a game of chess. She was the queen being forced to kill her own king. Furthermore, the experience of being a weapon left Jill with a profound sense of self-loathing. Even though she was not legally or morally responsible for her actions under mind control, she felt the weight of every strike she landed and every shot she fired. She viewed herself as a biological hazard, a thing that could be turned against her loved ones at any moment. This led to a state of permanent self-surveillance, where she constantly questioned her own motives and her own identity. She began to fear her own skills, as if her master of unlocking ability was a curse that could be used to open the doors to hell. This moral injury is the primary reason why Jill did not immediately return to active duty after her rescue. She did not trust herself, and she certainly did not trust the BSAA to keep her from being used as a weapon again. The legacy of being Wesker's weapon was a permanent fracture in her relationship with the concept of heroism. Jill no longer saw herself as a protector. She saw herself as a potential threat. The violation was so complete that she felt she had lost the right to be a hero. She had been the monster, the enforcer, and the assassin, and those memories were burned into her retinas. Even as Chris held her in the helicopter after the device was removed, she felt like she was a stain on his uniform. She had been used as a weapon to destroy the one thing that was good in her life, and that was a tragedy that would haunt her through every mission that followed. Jill Valentine was free, but she was still holding the gun, and in her mind, she was still pulling the trigger. Part 16: Physical Rescue versus Mental Damage. The removal of the P30 device from Jill Valentine's chest in the year 2009 was a moment of profound physical liberation that simultaneously initiated a new era of psychological imprisonment. While the world celebrated the rescue of the legendary STARS member, the clinical reality inside the BSAA rehabilitation laboratories was one of total fragmentation. Jill was no longer the woman who had entered the Spencer estate 3 years prior. She was a biologically altered specimen, suffering from what researchers called agency anxiety. The iron logic of her recovery was based on the premise that her body could be cleansed of the chemical inhibitors, but her mind remained tethered to the 3 years of enslavement. Every time she moved a finger or spoke a word, she experienced a momentary panic, questioning if the action was truly her own, or if a ghost of the P-30 command was still lingering in her neural pathways. The physical rescue was only the first step in a grueling process that lasted for years. Because of the high doses of the chemical and the cryogenic stasis she had endured, Jill's body was in a state of constant metabolic flux. Her hair remained white, and her skin remained unnaturally pale, serving as a permanent visual reminder of her time as Wesker's puppet. The sorrow of the laboratory was the realization that while her blood was being washed of the toxins, her memories were being flooded with the horrors she had committed. She spent months in a sterile white room, being monitored by technicians who looked at her with a mixture of awe and pity. To them, she was a hero who had returned from the dead, but to herself, she was a contaminated object. The trauma of the rescue was the sudden return of her individual will, which forced her to face the full weight of the 3 missing years. Furthermore, the mental damage was exacerbated by the loss of her sense of time. To Jill, the years between 2006 and 2009 were a blurred sequence of violet-tinted visions and cold commands. Reintegrating into a world that had moved on without her was a source of profound existential dread. She found herself in a state of perpetual recovery, where she was never allowed to forget her status as a victim. The BSAA treated her as a priceless asset that needed to be protected, which further eroded her sense of autonomy. She had traded the control of Albert Wesker for the control of a military organization, and she struggled to find a middle ground where she was simply Jill Valentine. This agency anxiety meant that she was constantly second-guessing her own emotions, wondering if her grief or her anger was a genuine human response or a biological byproduct of her trauma. The legacy of the physical rescue was a woman who was physically safe, but mentally shattered. She had been brought back from the brink of extinction, only to find that the world she returned to was just as predatory as the one she had left. The labs of the BSAA were not a sanctuary, but a reminder of the scientific arrogance that had destroyed her life. Jill began to view her own body as a crime scene, a place where a biological violation had occurred and could never be fully repaired. This sense of being a damaged good became the foundation of her late career identity, ensuring that she would never again seek the warmth of a normal life. She was a survivor of the ultimate violation, and the price of her freedom was a life spent looking over her shoulder at the shadow of the woman she used to be. Part 17. Guilt over actions under control. The deepest and most persistent psychological wound Jill Valentine carried after her rescue was the overwhelming guilt over the actions she had performed while under the influence of the P-30 chemical. Despite the constant reassurances from Chris Redfield and the BSAA medical staff that she was not morally responsible for her behavior, Jill could not disconnect from the visceral memory of the crimes she had committed. She remembered the faces of the people she had attacked and the cold efficiency with which she had served Wesker's goals. This moral injury was a psychological cataclysm that left her in a state of permanent self-loathing. She did not view herself as a victim of mind control. She viewed herself as a weapon that had allowed itself to be fired. The iron reality of her guilt was that it functioned as a form of self-punishment, a way to hold on to a sense of agency by claiming responsibility for her own trauma. The clinical expression of this guilt was a total withdrawal from any activity that reminded her of her time as the Bird Lady. She refused to use certain combat techniques and felt a profound revulsion toward the color violet. The sorrow of this period was her inability to accept the forgiveness of her partner. When Chris looked at her with love and relief, Jill only saw the man she had almost killed. She felt that her very presence was a reminder of his failure to protect her and her failure to resist. This created a profound rift in their relationship, where the more Chris tried to help her, the more Jill retreated into her guilt. She believed that she had forfeited her right to be a hero, and that every second of her continued survival was an insult to those who had died at her hands. This self-loathing was the internal cage that replaced the physical one Wesker had built. Furthermore, Jill's guilt was intensified by her intimate knowledge of how her skills were used. She saw that her master of unlocking precision had been used to bypass security systems for Tricell, and her Delta Force training had been used to train other bioorganic weapons. She felt that her life's work had been subverted and turned into a dark mirror of itself. This led to a state of psychological paralysis, where she no longer trusted her own talents. She feared that if she picked up a weapon, she would instinctively revert to the killing machine she had been for 3 years. This fear of her own competence was a unique form of trauma that kept her from returning to active duty for years. She was a soldier who was terrified of her own shadow, a master of entry who felt like she had been locked out of her own soul. The legacy of this guilt was a persistent need for penance. Jill began to view every future mission as a way to earn back the life she had been given. This was a dangerous motivation as it pushed her toward increasingly reckless behavior. She was no longer fighting for the world. She was fighting to erase the version of herself that had existed under Wesker. But the memory of the bird lady was indelible. It was a stain on her record and a scar on her conscience that no amount of heroic action could fully remove. Jill Valentine was a prisoner of her own morality, a woman who was haunted by the blood on her hands, even though the hands had not been her own. Her guilt was the final victory for Wesker, a lingering command that she could never disobey. Part 18. Trust Issues after Wesker. Following her liberation from the control of Albert Wesker, Jill Valentine developed a baseline of paranoia that fundamentally altered her relationship with authority and her own instincts. The realization that her mind could be hijacked and her body turned against her loved ones led to a state of chronic mistrust that she called the silent surveillance. If a man like Wesker could manipulate the very chemistry of her brain, then who was to say that the BSEA or the government was not doing the same? The iron logic of her paranoia was that no one could be trusted, not even herself. This trust collapse was not directed just at potential enemies, but at the entire structure of the modern world. She began to view every medical procedure, every tactical order, and every social interaction as a potential form of subversion. The clinical manifestation of these trust issues was a refusal to participate in the standard BSAA health screenings and a profound skepticism toward the organization's leadership. She began to operate as a rogue element within the system, using her master of unlocking skills to keep a private archive of the agency's internal movements. The sorrow of this paranoia was her isolation from the Brotherhood of the Stars. She found herself questioning the motives of even her closest friends, wondering if they were truly her protectors or if they were merely her handlers. This was a life lived in a state of permanent Cold War, where every handshake was a tactical assessment and every smile was a potential mask. Jill's inability to trust was a psychological defense mechanism that prevented her from being hurt again, but it also prevented her from ever truly coming home. Furthermore, Jill's trust issues were focused inward on her own biological state. Because she had been infected with the T virus and then modified by the P30, she felt that her body was a ticking time bomb of viral potential. She did not trust her own DNA to remain stable, and she feared that the next version of herself would be even more monstrous than the last. This led to a state of hypervigilance regarding her own health, where she would obsessively monitor her heart rate, her skin temperature, and her cognitive speed for any sign of viral reemergence. She felt like a biological anomaly, an outsider who was only being tolerated because she was useful. This existential mistrust made her colder and more detached as she prepared herself for the inevitable moment when her own biology would betray her again. The legacy of these trust issues was a woman who was perpetually on the outside looking in. Even as she regained her status as a legendary operative, she did not feel like a part of the team. She was a ghost in the barracks, a woman who knew too much about the fragility of the human will to ever believe in the stability of the social contract. Her paranoia was her armor, but it was also her coffin. By the year 2026, Jill Valentine had become a master of secrecy, a person who had picked the lock of every corporate conspiracy, only to find that there was no one left to trust with the truth. She was a survivor of the ultimate betrayal, and the price of her awareness was a world where every face was a potential enemy and every room was a potential trap. Part 19. Hyper-competence as armor. By the time Jill Valentine returned to the field in the mid-2010s, she had adopted a persona of hyper-competence that served as her primary psychological armor. This was not the natural evolution of her skills, but a desperate and rigid shell used to hide her internal fragility. Jill believed that if she could become the perfect soldier, a woman who never missed a shot, never failed a mission, and never showed a single moment of hesitation, she could somehow protect herself from the chaotic horror of her past. The iron logic of this armor was that perfection left no room for vulnerability. If she was the fastest, the strongest, and the most efficient, she could outrun the memories of the mansion and the pod. This hyper-competence was a performance for an audience of one, herself. She was trying to prove that she was still in control by mastering every physical variable of her environment. The clinical expression of this armor was a cold and surgical approach to combat. Jill became a woman of few words and absolute precision. Her tactical movements were described as almost robotic, as she cleared rooms and neutralized targets with a speed that bordered on the superhuman. The sorrow of this perfection was the total erasure of her personality. There was no joy in her victories and no anger in her struggles. There was only the mission. She used her skills to build a wall of lead and steel between her and the rest of the world. If she stayed in combat mode, she didn't have to face the silence of her own mind. This was a form of active dissociation, where her hypercompetence allowed her to leave her humanity at the door and become a singular instrument of the BSAA. Furthermore, this armor of competence was a response to the agency anxiety she had developed after Kijuju. By pushing her body to the absolute limit, she was constantly confirming that her movements were her own. Every successful mission was a victory over the ghost of the P-30. But this quest for perfection was an exhausting and unsustainable burden. She was terrified that if she made a single mistake, it would mean that she was losing her mind or her autonomy again. This led to a state of chronic stress and burnout that she masked with an even colder exterior. She was like a blade that was being sharpened until it was too thin to hold an edge. The world saw a legendary hero, but the clinical record shows a woman who was one miss away from a total psychological collapse. The legacy of this hypercompetence was the Death Island era, Jill who looked older and sharper than ever before. She had become the ultimate master of unlocking, but the only thing she was trying to unlock was a way out of her own skin. Her strength was her burden, and her skill was her cage. She had become so good at being a soldier that she had forgotten how to be anything else. This was the final tragedy of her training. The military that had forged her as a weapon had succeeded so well that there was nothing of the girl from the 1990s left. Jill Valentine was the most effective biowarfare operative on the planet, but she was a woman who had traded her soul for a tactical advantage. Her armor was impenetrable, but it was also cold, and in the end, it left her alone, in a world that only valued her for the shots she didn't miss. Part 20. Fear of Attachment. In the final evolution of her psychological breakdown, Jill Valentine entered a state of profound fear regarding emotional attachment. This was the logical conclusion of a life defined by loss, betrayal, and violation. Jill had learned through the most agonizing experience possible that anyone she allowed herself to care for would eventually become a target, a victim, or a weapon against her. To protect herself and to protect those she loved, she began to systematically sabotage her personal relationships and maintain a state of borrowed time existence. The iron reality of her fear was the belief that her presence was a curse. She viewed herself as a magnet for disaster, and she refused to let anyone else be caught in the pull. This led to a permanent distance between her and her closest allies, including Chris Redfield and Barry Burton. The clinical manifestation of this fear was a total avoidance of any long-term commitments or personal intimacy. Jill did not have a home, she had a series of temporary barracks. She did not have relationships, she had partnerships that ended the moment the mission was over. The sorrow of this isolation was most visible in her relationship with Chris. Despite the years they had spent together and the life-changing trauma they had shared, Jill refused to allow their bond to move beyond the professional sphere. She treated him with a cold respect that was designed to keep him at arm's length. She was terrified that if she truly let him in, he would be the next one to die, or the next one she would be forced to kill. This was a tragedy of mutual silence, where the two people who needed each other the most were the ones least capable of reaching out. Furthermore, Jill's fear of attachment was a form of existential preemptive mourning. She believed that her own life was already over, and that she was merely a ghost waiting for the final mission. Because she did not believe she had a future, she did not see the point in building anything that would last. This ghost status made her a terrifyingly effective operative because she had nothing left to lose, but it also made her a hollow and tragic figure. She walked through the world like a visitor, never leaving a footprint and never letting anyone leave a mark on her. She had picked the lock of the human heart and found that it was too fragile to survive the world of the viruses. So she decided to keep her own heart in a vault where it would be safe and cold and entirely alone. The legacy of this fear was the total erasure of Jill's support network. By the year 2026, she was a woman with no anchors and no roots. She was the legendary Jill Valentine, a name that inspired awe in the recruits of the BSAA, but a name that meant nothing to the woman who carried it. She had successfully isolated herself from the pain of loss by losing everything in advance. This was the ultimate defense mechanism of the trauma survivor, to become so alone that no one could ever leave you. Jill had survived the Arklay Mountains, Raccoon City, and the labs of Africa, but she had not survived the silence that followed. She was a woman who was perfectly safe because she was perfectly alone. And in the world of Resident Evil, that was the most profound tragedy of all. Part 21. Strength versus exhaustion. In the year 2026, the physiological and psychological state of Jill Valentine is defined by a paradoxical relationship between her supernatural strength and her profound spiritual exhaustion. While the viral legacies within her body, the remnants of the T virus and the P30 chemical, have granted her a physical resilience that surpasses almost any other human being, her mind is in a state of terminal burnout. This is the hidden cost of always surviving. To the world, she is a legendary operative who never slows down, but the clinical record reveals a woman who is essentially a living battery that has been drained and recharged too many times. The iron reality of her existence is that she has been denied the natural release of aging and the quiet of retirement because the world viewed her as too valuable an asset to lose. She has saved the planet multiple times, but she has never been allowed to save herself from the fatigue of her own history. The clinical expression of this exhaustion is a state of chronic sensory overload and emotional depletion. Jill's nervous system has been tuned to such a high degree of tactical awareness that she can no longer find the off switch. Even in the safest of environments, her brain continues to scan for viral signatures and tactical weaknesses. The sorrow of this state is that her strength has become her primary burden. Because she is so competent and so resilient, the BSAA and her peers have subconsciously expected her to carry the heaviest loads of the biowarfare era. She has become the designated survivor, the person who is sent into the most hopeless situations, because they know she will find a way out. But every exit she unlocks takes a piece of her soul with it. She is a woman who is tired of the fire, but who is constantly being pushed back into the center of the flame. Furthermore, the exhaustion Jill experiences is an existential one. She has lived through the death of the 20th century, the collapse of Raccoon City, and the rise and fall of global pharmaceutical empires. She has seen the same cycles of human greed and scientific arrogance repeat themselves for over 30 years. This repetition has led to a profound sense of futility. She asks herself what the point of surviving the mansion was, if she was only meant to witness the world becoming a mansion on a global scale. This exhaustion makes her colder and more cynical, as she realizes that her strength is only delaying the inevitable. She is like an athlete who has been forced to run a race that has no finish line. The hyper-competence that she uses as armor is also the very thing that keeps her from being allowed to rest. Her body is a temple of viral power, but the priestess inside is weeping from the sheer weight of the history she carries. The legacy of this strength versus exhaustion dynamic is the ghost Jill who walks through the world of 2026. She is a woman who has become so detached from her own needs that she no longer recognizes them. She eats because it is a caloric necessity. She sleeps because it is a tactical requirement, and she fights because it is the only thing she knows how to do. She is a person who has been hollowed out by her own efficacy. Her exhaustion is not something that can be fixed with a vacation or a medical leave. It is a fundamental part of her identity. Jill Valentine is the ultimate survivor, but the true tragedy of her survival is that she is too strong to die and too tired to live. She is a monument to the endurance of the human spirit, but like all monuments, she is made of cold, unmoving stone. Part 22. Jill Valentine as a trauma survivor. To analyze Jill Valentine in 2026 is to look at the most profound study of complex post-traumatic stress disorder in the history of the biohazard era. Unlike other survivors who have found ways to channel their trauma into leadership or civic activism, Jill has internalized her damage into a dense and impenetrable dissociative shell. She is not a hero in the traditional sense. She is a clinically damaged person who has become functional through a process of absolute self-fragmentation. The iron logic of her survival is that she has survived by ceasing to exist as a feeling human being. She has compartmentalized every horror she has witnessed, the rotting faces of her friends, the roar of the nemesis, and the violation of the P-30 into separate vaults of memory that she only accesses for tactical data. She is not fine. She is simply functional. The clinical profile of Jill's trauma is characterized by a state of permanent hyperarousal and emotional numbing. She experiences the world as a series of triggers that she must navigate with surgical precision. The sorrow of her condition is the loss of her sense of self. When she looks at her reflection, she does not see the girl from the 1990s who loved her family and her craft. She sees a tactical timeline of infections and betrayals. Her trauma is not a single event, but a cumulative layer of violations that have rewritten her personality. She suffers from a profound sense of moral injury, the belief that she has been stained by the world to such a degree that she can never be clean again. This self-perception keeps her from seeking the help she needs, because she believes that the help is a delusion. To Jill, the trauma is the truth, and everything else is just a temporary mask. Furthermore, Jill's trauma is unique because it is both psychological and biological. Her DNA is a literal archive of the disasters she has survived. She cannot move past her trauma because her own cells are a reminder of the T virus and the experiments of Albert Wesker. This creates a state of existential entrapment where the body she inhabits is a witness for the prosecution. She is a trauma survivor who is forced to carry the weapon of her assault inside her own veins. This led to the Death Island era, where she exhibited signs of severe depression and a reckless disregard for her own safety. She was not trying to be a hero. She was trying to see if the world was finally finished with her. Her survival is a testament to her strength, but it is also a condemnation to a life where the memories of the dead are more real than the presence of the living. The legacy of Jill as a trauma survivor is a warning about the limits of human endurance. She has shown that while a person can be trained to survive anything, they cannot be trained to stay whole. She is a shattered mirror that has been glued back together in the shape of a soldier. While she can still reflect the light of a hero, the cracks are visible to anyone who looks closely. She is a woman who has given everything to a world that keeps asking for more. And she is the definitive proof that in the world of Resident Evil, the cost of survival is the loss of the soul. Jill Valentine is the most decorated survivor of the stars, but she is also its most tragic victim, a ghost who is haunted by her own continued existence. Part 23. Why Jill never gets closure. In the landscape of 2026, the concept of closure for Jill Valentine is a biological and psychological impossibility. While the Umbrella Corporation has officially collapsed and its founders have been consigned to the grave, the legacy of their work is permanently etched into the world and into Jill herself. The iron reality of her life is that there is no finish line for the war she is fighting. As long as there is a single vial of the progenitor legacy in existence, a part of Jill's trauma remains active. She is tied to the viruses at a cellular level, making her life a permanent archive of the enemy's crimes. She cannot get closure because the closing of the Umbrella chapter did not remove the stain from her blood or the memories from her mind. She is a woman who is trapped in a loop where the ghost of the past is always the threat of the future. The clinical reason for this lack of closure is the nature of bioterrorism itself. Unlike a conventional war which has a defined beginning and end, the biological war is an endless cycle of mutation and re-emergence. Every time Jill thinks she has put a monster to rest, a new variant appears in a different corner of the globe. This creates a state of permanent mobilization where she can never truly put down her weapon. The sorrow of her situation is the realization that the peace she fought for in Raccoon City was a myth. The world did not get better. It just got more dangerous in more sophisticated ways. This lack of external closure mirrors her internal state. She cannot forgive herself for her actions under Wesker's control, because the world keeps reminding her of what a human being can become when they lose their agency. She is a victim who is constantly being asked to re-traumatize herself for the sake of global security. Furthermore, Jill's lack of closure is a result of her own hyper-competence. Because she is so good at what she does, she is never allowed to step away. The world has made her survival a requirement for its own, and this creates a psychological cage where she is forced to be the eternal guardian of a civilization that failed her. She sees the faces of the people she lost in every new outbreak, and she feels the same sense of failure every time a city is quarantined. This is a life lived in the shadow of a recurring nightmare. She cannot have a funeral for her past because her past is still walking the earth in the form of the mold, the sea virus, and whatever comes next. She is a master of unlocking who has finally found the one door that cannot be opened, the door to a life without umbrella. The legacy of this lack of closure is the cold and sharp version of Jill who appears in the recent records. She has stopped looking for an end to the war and has instead accepted that the war is her only reality. She does not dream of a quiet home or a peaceful retirement because she knows those things are not for her. She has traded her future for a permanent present where the only thing that matters is the next mission. This is the true tragedy of Jill Valentine. She is a survivor who has been denied the one thing that makes survival meaningful, which is the chance to move on. She is a ghost of a dead era, wandering through a world that is still being consumed by the fires she thought she had extinguished 30 years ago. Part 24. Jill, compared to other survivors. When we compare the psychological profile of Jill Valentine to the other legendary survivors of the Resident Evil era, we see a distinct and haunting archetype that separates her from her peers. While Leon Kennedy has become a hardened cynic, and Chris Redfield has evolved into a weary but determined leader, Jill has become something else entirely. A ghost. Leon uses his disillusionment as a way to engage with the world on his own terms, and Chris uses his sense of duty to build institutions like the BSAA. But Jill has no such anchor. She has been killed and reborn so many times. Through the fire of Raccoon City, the infection of the T virus, and the mental erasure of the P30, that she no longer knows which version of Jill is the real one. She is a void in the shape of a woman, a tactical instrument that has lost its human core. The clinical contrast between Jill and the others is most evident in her lack of a civilian anchor. Claire Redfield has her work with TerraSave and her connection to her family. Barry Burton has his daughters and his legacy. Even Leon has his complicated relationship with the concept of justice, but Jill has nothing but the mission. The sorrow of her comparison is the realization that she has been more thoroughly dismantled by the biological war than anyone else. She was the one who was specifically targeted by the Nemesis. She was the one who was biologically modified by Wesker, and she was the one who was forced to be a passenger in her own body for years. This level of personal violation has left her with a sense of otherness that prevents her from connecting with her fellow survivors. She is a biological hybrid in a room of humans, a ghost at a table of living men. Furthermore, Jill's role as the master of unlocking has taken on a dark psychological meaning, in comparison to her peers. While Chris breaks through walls and Leon navigates the bureaucracy, Jill is the one who enters the dark spaces. She is the one who goes where others cannot. And this has left her with a unique perspective on the absolute rot of the human soul. She has seen the interior of the labs and the minds of the monsters in a way that the others have not. This has made her colder and more detached. While the others fight to save the world, Jill fights to prevent the darkness she carries inside from consuming everything else. She is not fighting for a better future. She is fighting to maintain the stalemate between humanity and extinction. She is the silent guardian, the one who stays in the shadows so that the others can walk in the light. The legacy of Jill, compared to other survivors, is the recognition that she is the most tragic figure of the stars. She is the one who gave the most and kept the least. She is a woman who has survived everything, but has been left with nothing. While Chris and Leon are the faces of the resistance, Jill is the soul of its suffering. She is the reminder that even the strongest can be broken, and even the best can be turned. By the year 2026, she is a legendary name that has lost its human meaning. She is a ghost of the 1990s, haunting a future that she helped create but can never truly inhabit. Her burden is unique because it is absolute. She is the only survivor who has truly lost herself in the process of saving everyone else. Part 25. Final verdict: Jill's true tragedy. The final verdict on the life of Jill Valentine in the year 2026 is a clinical and heartbreaking confirmation of a tragedy that has been decades in the making. The true tragedy is not that she was betrayed, that she was infected, or that she was enslaved. The true tragedy is that she survived. In the world of Resident Evil, where biological horror has become a permanent part of the global landscape, survival is sometimes a worse fate than dying. For Jill, survival has meant witnessing the erasure of her friends, the burning of her city, and the systematic dismantling of her own identity. She has been forced to live through 1,000 deaths, only to wake up every morning in a body that is no longer hers and a world that she no longer recognizes. Her story is the definitive proof that peace is the only thing the master of unlocking can never truly reach. The iron reality of Jill's tragedy is the permanence of her trauma. There is no cure for what has happened to her soul, and there is no therapy that can erase the 3 years of being a weapon for her enemy. She is a woman who is living on borrowed time in a world that she has saved, but which has no place for her. The sorrow of the final analysis is the realization that Jill is waiting for an end that will likely never come. Because of her viral enhancements and her elite training, she will continue to survive mission after mission, becoming colder, sharper, and more detached with every passing year. She is a hero who has become a ghost, a woman who has been refined into a tool for a war that has no end. Her survival is a miracle of science, but it is a failure of humanity. Furthermore, the final verdict confirms that Jill's true tragedy is her isolation. She has become so competent at survival that she has separated herself from the very people she was fighting to protect. She is a legendary figure who is loved by millions but known by no one. Even those who care for her, most like Chris Redfield, can only see the hero and the survivor. They cannot see the broken girl who just wants the noise to stop. She is trapped in a cycle of duty and damage that has become her only reality. She is the master of unlocking, but the one door she cannot pick is the one that leads to her own peace. She is a prisoner of her own excellence, a woman who has become so good at fighting that she has forgotten how to be anything else. Her life is a record of victories that feel like defeats, and a history of survival that feels like an execution. In the end, the story of Jill Valentine is a reminder of the absolute cost of the biohazard era. She is the living manifestation of the damage we have done to ourselves in the pursuit of power and evolution. She is a ghost of a world that once believed in justice and order, now wandering through a landscape of rot and mutation. The final verdict is a simple and devastating one. Jill Valentine has survived everything, but she has found no peace. She is the eternal survivor, a woman who is doomed to walk the earth until the last virus is purged and the last lock is picked. Her tragedy is the tragedy of the human race in the 21st century. We have learned how to survive, but we have forgotten how to live. Jill Valentine is the most powerful woman in the world, and she is the most alone. She is the master of unlocking, and she is forever trapped inside.